So this is Lady Jane Grey, and this is her mate, who I named Pacific Blue. They've been the resident bluebirds of my backyard for 4 years. And then over winter break, a Eurasian tree sparrow got into the nest box while she was inside. And these sparrows are close relatives of house sparrows. They're also an old world sparrow, but they are found in certain areas of the United States. So this Eurasian tree sparrow got into the nest box while Lady Jane Grey was inside and killed her. And it's really depressing when you lose a bluebird who's been around for 4 years and very consistent. You learn all about their mannerisms. So it's really sad. However, a new female came into the scene this season. This is Lady Coppertone. Her presence left me with a question, because if she's different, who's the guy? Is that Pacific Blue, who is Lady Jane Grey's mate and has also been defending this territory for the last 4 years, or is this a different male? And if it is Pacific Blue, because it would stand to reason that, why would he give up his territory even though he lost his mate? He may still defend his territory. So if it is him, who is the girl, Lady Coppertone? Is she one of his daughters? And that just seems likely. I mean, these guys after 4 years have had brood after brood after brood of bluebirds. And I think in total, probably 35 to 40 bluebirds. So it got me wondering, is there a little bit of a scandal happening? Is the dad and the daughter getting together and mating? Or is this someone else? Is this a different male? What is going on? And that led me to question, how do birds protect themselves from inbreeding or incest in the first place? That's what this episode is all about, and I think this is kind of a fun topic because it is a really curious thing in nature. What stops inbreeding from happening? So we're going to look at 2 mechanisms that prevent or minimize the risk of inbreeding, and there's a few more out there, but I'm just going to talk about 2 in particular because they seem to be, after doing a lot of research on this, they seem to be the strongest mechanisms that prevent inbreeding from happening in birds. Before getting into these mechanisms, I do want to talk about why we don't want this to happen in birds. I mean, we definitely don't want this in people, and it's basically the same reason we don't want this in people is the same reason we don't want this anywhere in wildlife, is that it reduces genetic diversity, and then it also opens up the offspring to inherit more disease that came through genes and everything. Preventing inbreeding opens up the gene pool. It introduces new traits into the offspring. It helps with adaptation. Sometimes it introduces interesting mutations and variations and everything. And so overall, in biology, there is a inherent goal of diversifying your genes. That sounds like such an overly technical way to put it, but there's a goal of not inbreeding. There's also just the health of the bird in general, or any wildlife in general, is stronger when there's more diversity involved. Because biology strongly selects against inbreeding, a lot of biologists are always curious about the mechanisms that stop inbreeding from happening. And the great thing is that there's a lot of research available on this. And, I was really surprised by this, but there is a lot of research on bluebirds and inbreeding. And part of that is just because they're cavity nesters, and it's so much easier to do field studies and do observations when a bird is in a box and you know exactly where the nest is, and you can take DNA samples of the birds and everything. So it's just really easy to study. But there is one researcher who did a lot of field studies on western bluebirds and the mechanisms that prevented inbreeding. And so this was a fascinating journey and great to learn about. The first mechanism that is pretty strong that helps prevent inbreeding is song discrimination. And again, I sound really technical, but basically, your family's voice. You grew up with them and you know what your family sounds like. And so that's kind of the discrimination there. You can differentiate between your family members, and the same is true for songbirds. Sometimes it's hard for us to tell a distinction between different birds, but the birds can discriminate. They know who their dad is, they know who their brothers and sisters are. they can pick up on that sound. You know, it's just they're a little more acute in that department than we are. So song discrimination in birds is a key right there. And the cool thing is with these field studies, some of the ways that they were able to study this is just in closed environments, putting kin or family members together and then introducing non-family members and then looking at the breeding that takes place. And they were able to see that in most cases, they were able to discriminate against family and go to non-family members for breeding. And so that's really cool how they've done the research in order to figure out that they can discriminate against song in the first place. And this isn't just in bluebirds, this is in a lot of other bird species too. Maybe something you can do when you go out is you hear your local cardinals, and I point them out because they're such pronounced singers. But you hear your local cardinals and they have a sound. Go to a park or a nature trail and listen to the cardinals there. And you may hear subtle differences in the way they sound versus how they sound in your neighborhood. One of the things I notice is there's one park in particular where it's softer. It's just not as bold. And maybe it's also because it's quieter, it's at a park, and they're not having to sing above road noise and stuff like that. The next big mechanism, and this was to me the biggest thing that really stood out, is this idea of sex-biased dispersal. And what this means, I hope I put this the right way, is that in different species, there is a bias, whether it's the males or the females. One of the two sexes will disperse while the other stays more local or in their natal areas. And so by natal, what I mean is the area that they were born. So one sex will travel farther distances and the other will stay nearby and establish nearby territories. For birds, there's a bias for the female birds to disperse and the male birds stay in more local areas. The offspring will establish nearby territories, fill vacant spots in that area. So with bluebirds, their territory range is about 300 to 350 feet apart. So a son, an offspring male, will maybe go 350, 400 feet out and try and establish territory, whereas a female will go kilometers out. And this is what they've studied. Females could travel like 600 meters out to as far as 2 kilometers or even more. And the males kind of stay in the local area. The cool thing is that I kind of had confirmation of this in the winter. There was a day where there were just a lot of birds out. I had some seed out on the stump and some platforms. And I just noticed the bluebirds were coming, and there were a lot of bluebirds, but they were all male, maybe 2 females. And I figured one was Lady Jane Grey, my former resident female. And there was one other female kind of hanging around. It could have been a different female from a different territory that just kind of found her way over here because there was food available. So these mechanisms are probably some of the stronger mechanisms that I found, but that doesn't completely stop inbreeding from happening. And in fact, some of the sons that stay by near the territory, sometimes they don't find their own territory or their own mate. And what can happen is that if there's a male vacancy, or maybe the female is fertile and her mate is off somewhere else, the son and the mother can copulate or, you know, get it on, I guess. If you want to know more about bluebird mating, I have a video about that because that is also really interesting. Bluebirds are socially monogamous birds, and for the most part, they're fairly sexually monogamous, but they're not completely sexually monogamous. And so they will have extra pair copulations is what it's called. And this would be a situation where some inbreeding could happen between mother and helper son birds where she was fertile, mate was nowhere to be found, and the sun came. There's also studies that I found where the more environmental stress there is, the more likely inbreeding will happen. And I think that makes sense. You know, if resources are limited, if breeding selection is limited, if food is limited, if breeding territory is limited, I mean, all you got is who you got, you know? And nature has to have its way in reproduction. And so that made complete sense to me too. But that is something interesting, and it kind of counteracts the mechanisms that are in place to safeguard against inbreeding and everything. So while these are in place, it's not to say that inbreeding doesn't happen, but it was actually surprisingly low how often inbreeding happened. And I don't remember what the stats are. And I think part of the reason is because from one study to the next and one species to the next, those stats are different. And part of that is because there's different variables. I just remember in different papers that I looked at, the frequency of inbreeding was really low, and in some cases it was near zero where inbreeding was happening. So in the end, I think I've got my answer here. I don't think the female, this Lady Coppertone, is Lady Jane Grey's daughter or sister or anything like that. I think based on sex bias dispersal, this is another female who's found her way into the territory, and either the male is Pacific Blue or it's a different male. But the great news is that I can be fairly confident that there's not inbreeding happening. If you want to learn a little more about bluebird mating, I've got that other video, and I just thought this was a really interesting topic. If you've got some stories to share, or maybe some facts that I mentioned that you were like, oh, I never knew that, leave some comments below. I love having those discussions with you all, and thank you so much.